I have the honor of introducing our keynote, but first I want to ask a question. How many of you have been involved with Mr. Rosen either as a consultant or having him come speak to you directly, not in a conference like this, but in your agency or in your company? Raise your hands. Not as many as I would have expected. How many of you know that David Rosen is a doctor? Go ahead, come on, raise your hands. Dr. Rosen, who unfortunately was not educated in California, we don't hold that against you, David, has consulted with 40 different states, over 200 other jurisdictions, including, I would have expected, half of the people in this room, the redevelopment agencies. I first met him 30 years ago, I think. I had dark hair then.
I had.
Yeah, I know. I remember. When I was working for the San Diego Housing Commission, which was the public housing authority for the city of San Diego, David has one of the broadest backgrounds. He's almost the pure Renaissance man, but I don't know that he paints or creates music. No? Okay. So he's not quite Leonardo da Vinci. He's worked in the areas of energy policy, of finance. He's consulted, as I said, with hundreds, literally hundreds of organizations and agencies. So we're going to get some of the value of his collected knowledge, but I think we're going to get some particular value from his most recent activities. One of the things that I didn't know about David was that he was the inaugural chairman. How many of you know what coin is? And you're not holding your hand up tall enough, Steve. Come on, up there. How many of you know that there is a state tax credit for CDFIs created under the Department of Insurance that will encourage development so that those organizations will have money to help your developers build in your communities? David was the inaugural chair of the group that enacted, set up, and it was just reauthorized this year, so we're good for a few more years, and you might want to look at that as you're talking to community-based organizations that do finance as to whether they're part of the COIN network and whether or not they qualify, because it's a way to get more money in your deals, back to the other people's money slides that we saw this morning. David has currently been very active. He's done, I think you said, 5 different briefings with the White House Office of Urban Affairs, talking about how federal investment in real estate and housing and economic development can be restructured, because obviously it needs some kind of restructuring. It isn't working very well the way it's going, and given what Congress seems to be doing, something's got to change out there, and I hope we're going to hear a little bit about that. David has also worked on energy policy, especially, I know from personal experience, on solar energy issues. A lot of people are trying to figure out how to get sustainable community policies in. David is another resource that you can go to talk about how to get better energy efficiency, how to use alternative energy sources in the developments that you're putting up. With that, I think we should let David, most of us are used to saying, I'm going to give you my 2 cents worth, but in keeping with Mr. Kennedy's concept of paradigms, I think with David, you're always good for at least 2 dimes, 20 cents worth.
Thank you, Tim. 30 years ago.
At least, yeah.
And you had to bring up the subject of hair. Jim, thank you so much.
You're
and,
still thin.
Mary Ellen. Right. You know, Jim, I have bad news for you. The board consulted me yesterday morning, and I know that you're legendary for your skills at developer negotiations, but evidently you slipped up a little bit in your employment agreement with CRA. And I'm sorry to say that there actually is no exit provision in your agreement. And
lifetime sentence.
It's a lifetime sentence as needed. Meanwhile, Mary Ellen has been cursed with the task of babysitting developers desperate for the last round of MHP funding in the state of California, while she's at the same time trying to recruit me for this thankless task of encouraging a group who has literally the sword of Damocles held over your head by the California Supreme Court, by telling me that she can't take my call because she's got a developer client who is screaming at her for the 6th time that the table in Appendix 99, Bill, I want you to listen to this, of the MHP application was crooked and needed to be straightened out, and Mary Ellen just couldn't. Now, TCAC doesn't have those challenges, and that application process is thankfully much smoother. And Bill, I do want to acknowledge and thank your staff for research assistance on some of these remarks. I very much appreciate Gina's help. I'd like to acknowledge David Saltzman. David, if you could stand for a second. David is a senior associate with DRA. David owes a prior job to Dan Rostenkowski. Some of you may remember Dan, who chaired the House Ways and Means Committee and authored the tax credit legislation and carved out the City of Chicago's sole tax credit allocation from that of the state of Illinois. And David managed that program as Deputy Commissioner in Chicago. We're glad to have stolen him from that in prior venues. And I want to thank the staff here at CRA. I have found folks here to just be extraordinary, and Jim, you're quite right. Rich, Tom, Jeff, the entire crew, thank you so much for always making this such a pleasure. What I find difficult about the subject at hand is with this sort of Damocles, with the wreckage of a mortgage crisis that endures into its 4th year, a recession that has not produced jobs in 4 years, an economic recovery that is stumbling, a national and state fiscal crisis that seems irreparable, looming unemployment that is unbearably high, both at the national level and especially in our state, as we will hear, let alone the loss of redevelopment as the single largest state program to fund affordable housing in the United States. And I'm supposed to give answers to this. Well, I'm reminded of Mel Brooks in The 1,000-Year-Old Man, when Joan of Arc came up to the 1,000-Year-Old Man and said, Mel, I need your help. We have to save France. And Mel said, you go ahead, I got to go wash up. So we are facing what I characterize as a perfect storm in affordable housing policy and market conditions in California especially, and certainly in our country. The factors that I ticked off here are listed on the screen, and we're going to dig into these fairly deeply to give us a sense, in case we need it, of how bad it really is. But out of the depths of this problem, I think we find the seeds of answers and solutions. And I don't want to suggest this lightly or that we can do this tomorrow. But as we go through these data, I'd like to ask us to think collectively about how we can speak with one unified voice to reform federal finance and housing policy and state finance and budget and tax policy here in California to really recommit ourselves to revitalizing our communities in sustainable and equitable and progressive ways. What do we face as a result of this perfect storm? Well, if we accept where we are today, this is what we face. Let's just be blunt about it. $1.6 billion annually in set-aside funds are at risk in the Supreme Court case's decision in 8 weeks. The loss of literally hundreds of billions of dollars of equity. The mortgage crisis in the country cost homeowners and investors $7 trillion in lost net worth. But so that we don't start on a note of despair, I want to suggest and frame 7 components that I think show us a way out of this path. The first is we really need to focus on rebalancing our budget and tax policy as it affects housing and real estate. The second is we have to tackle in a serious, concerted, and immediate fashion the problem of underwater mortgages and mortgage modification. The third, we have to begin to think aggressively about our police power to zone land as a path to capture value for community benefits and to be unapologetic about that. The fourth is we need to think hard, and again, Bill and his staff at TCAC have helped point the way here, about the trade-offs between new construction and acquisition rehabilitation with regard to cost-benefit return for production of affordable units. At the risk of stating the obvious, we need to reform redevelopment, and I'm going to suggest an agenda for that. How many here work at a housing authority? How many of those who have your hand up are from Sacramento? So I saw 3 hands who aren't from Sacramento. Sacramento doesn't count because you're already integrated with the redevelopment and housing department, the only such agency in the state. We need to find partnerships with our sisters in housing authorities to stretch and leverage not only our financial dollars but our land assets as well. And lastly, with employers, both public and private sector, we need to find a way to help capitalize on employer-assisted housing programs. Well, how bad was the mortgage crisis? Well, 4 million foreclosures since 2008. We have 5 million to go. The decline in assessed valuation in California, 31%. The decline in sale prices nationally, 35%. Delinquencies point to another 5 million in foreclosures. Fannie and Freddie are gone at the cost of $161 billion. We'll talk a little bit more about why they're still here. The Federal Home Loan Bank System, for the first time in 65 years, suffered its first credit losses as a result of this crisis. Lenders are consolidating and credit and underwriting criteria. Those of us involved in development, raise your hand. Anybody having an easy time of it with your underwriting now and your lender and investor partners? You are? That palm? Underwater mortgages. This is invisible and astonishing. 12 million mortgages in the United States. 25% of every mortgage in this land is underwater, representing negative equity of an estimated $800 billion and an original principal balance of $3 trillion out of the total mortgage market of $11 trillion in the United States. In California, we're fortunate to have the highest number of underwater mortgages in the country, 2.1 million mortgages. That would suggest somewhere around $250 billion in negative equity. But don't worry, lenders are lending, right? Well, not really. The blue represents private lender mortgage originations in the United States since 1990. Can anybody see the line in 2011, the blue line? 90% of mortgage originations today come from Fannie, Freddie, and FHA. Unemployment? Well, like Barat said, not so good. So the national unemployment rate is about 9%. California's unemployment rate is hovering at 12% and has been persistently at 12% since 15, 16 months ago. Actually, I was encouraged, though, by the Wall Street Journal. I read the other day that the Consumer Confidence Index reached its highest level in 2 months. I couldn't believe that. I mean, I really couldn't believe I read that in the journal. So there are people and families affected by this unemployment crisis. About 14 million nationally, more than 2 million in California, but it's actually a lot worse than that. The effective unemployment rate in the state of California is 22%. This is the second highest effective rate in the nation and represents almost 4 million workers who are out of a job, underemployed, or have given up. But our fiscal house is in order, right? So the federal debt is 95% of the nation's GDP today, more than $14 trillion, and still growing. The deficit in 2011, this is actually a bit dated. I actually don't know the current number. Maybe somebody does. But I think by summer, David, maybe you have an answer on this. 1.3 trillion was just the FY 2011 debt in deficit in 1 year. But we're doing much better here, right? We should remind ourselves that the so-called budget solution in Sacramento closed a $25.5 billion gap that represented 30% of the state budget. We were 30% underwater with our state budget. And that doesn't address unfunded pension liabilities. I think Linda could talk about that. So she left. You know, we're going to bring you back up here to talk about pension reform, Linda. And we know that redevelopment is a part of the so-called solution to this. California, and perhaps our speaker tomorrow is going to speak about this, we have, shall we say, a structural problem with our fiscal house, and it is not in order. Historically, how do we stack up? This is actually a pretty interesting chart. So you can see that we only exceeded GDP during World War II. But what's particularly interesting about this, if you look at 1990, 1994, and 2000, a little hard to remember, but Clinton came into office in 92, inherited what was at the time a historic budget deficit and an historic debt. Anybody remember that? And Robert Rubin, in the interim period before he took office, taught Clinton that what he had to do was keep bond traders happy. And that was his first job. And Bill Clinton allegedly said, I did not get elected president of the United States to keep the bond market happy. And yet his chief political advisor said that when he died, he wanted to be reincarnated as the bond market. So in 94, post-stimulus efforts under Clinton, you see a little bit of a spike there in the deficit. And then by 2000, anybody remember what the federal debt was in 2000?
Positive.
Zero. We had a net positive income in the year 2000, and yet you can see that the national debt was about where it was when Clinton took office. And it only spiked in 08, 09, 010, and 011. It would be interesting to take off the Iraq-Afghan war and the Stimulus Act and see where we were. We'd be very close to where we were in, in 2003. Well, that's not all of our problems, right? We're not going to grow, so we don't have to take care of too many more people in our state, right? Not. California is projected to add 21 million people. You have to forgive me. I told Mary Ellen yesterday I had no voice, and today it's there, but kind of Lauren Bacall-esque. 21 million new people in 40 years, 7 million new households, 11 million new workers. So 11 million new jobs, not to mention the nearly 4 million underemployed and unemployed that we face today. I'm not sure where those jobs are going to come from, and sadly that's not the topic of today's talk, but I think it is something that CRA needs to speak to, and in my suggested solutions we'll talk a little bit about that. And I want to focus on this slide for a moment because I think we lose sight of this issue. The worst case housing needs under federal law have a definition. And these are the folks who most need housing assistance in the United States. And they're folks who are below 50% of the area median income and are paying more than half of their meager incomes for their housing expense, or they're in seriously substandard housing. The vast majority of the 7.1 million households who are worst case housing needs in the United States are overpaying for housing. The issue of severely dilapidated housing, thankfully, is not entirely behind us, but we've made tremendous strides since, frankly, since the Depression on that issue. This is a 20% increase in a 2-year period and is a direct reflection of the effects of the recession. We might remind ourselves that associated with this number is a 22% childhood poverty rate. And meanwhile, we learn that the top 1% income earners in the United States saw a 300% increase in their incomes since 1979, by far the largest income growth of any income group in the United States. We know what the threat is to redevelopment, but we haven't focused on our production. And I want to, and again, thanks to Bill's staff on TCAC, we're going to look at these slides in a second. But I want to talk with you a little bit about what we've done in housing in California and ask ourselves, is it enough? So 98,000 units, excuse me, since 1993, 18 years of production, about 5,400 units a year from low-mod housing set-aside funds, as reported by CRA. And if we look at production in California under the TCAC program and under the RDA program, we see the growth in tax increment peaking at about $2 billion a year in the low-mod housing fund, dropping directly as a result of the decline in assessed valuations to about $1.6 billion in 2011. This is prior to any CRAF takings of our funds. The red line is the fund balance. It's interesting to see that the housing fund balances track revenues, right? I'm sorry, expenditures, excuse me. And the gray line on the bottom is the fund balance. And we've been doing a good job of spending down those fund balances, as you see in the gray line at the bottom of the slide. The number of agencies really took off in the 80s. We have about 425 in the state. Average units produced, new and rehabilitated, bouncing around, averaging about, as I said, 5,500 units a year. And let's look at Bill's numbers here, both for TCAC and SIDLAC. The 9% program, once we get it really up and running, is producing about 5,500 units a year on average. We don't really know how much of that is a double count of the RDA numbers. And we actually tried to find this and couldn't. I'm not sure, Bill, that you and your staff have the number either, at least for anything other than 011. We couldn't find it. One research task I would suggest is that we need to find out where all the money has gone in terms of unit production. HCD, TCAC, SIDLAC, CalHFA, and the low-mod funds and the various HUD programs. And we need to find out what's double counted and not, so we get a real handle on what we're actually producing in California by way of affordability. The number of projects, about 80 a year, 9%. 4% units. Interestingly, this is a big number. This is 12, 13, 14,000 units a year prior to the crash in prices in 08 and 09, and which is now recovering in 2011. And this slide puts the two together, 9% and 4%. So you can see we're averaging about, in a more normalized period, 15 to 17,000 units a year from the two programs combined. Worst case housing needs in the state of California, maybe 1 million families. At this rate, 75 years. At 5,500 units a year from redevelopment agencies, 2 centuries. And that's to say nothing about the increase in worst case housing needs because of population growth in California. Project count. This is very important work by TCAC, the cost per unit. We're paying about twice the cost of acquisition rehab for new construction, in rough terms. And we have to ask ourselves, given scarce resources, if that's the best choice for us. And I suggest that there's really no good answer to that question because we're dealing in an era of scarcity. And as I get into my solution remarks, I want to try to get us out of a mindset of scarcity and again speak with one firm voice for a much more rational share of the nation's economy tied to our housing policy. This is really the problem. The federal policy for housing and finance is completely out of whack. We looked at 5 years of tax expenditures and spending for all real estate in the United States. We found that $650 billion was spent to subsidize home ownership. $200 billion, less than a third, was spent to subsidize rental housing. When we looked at the tax side alone, it's much worse. 5% of total tax expenditures for housing go to rental housing. 95% go to home ownership housing. I'm talking about the mortgage interest deduction, the property tax deduction, and the capital gains exclusion. 95%. Real estate tax expenditures dwarf, everything is dwarfed by the home ownership subsidies. Even general obligation bonds represents a small fraction of the subsidies we pay as taxpayers for home ownership. The tax credit program is where? $29 billion over 5 years compared to $650 billion over 5 years for home ownership. The projected 10-year tax expenditure of the current home ownership tax subsidies, anybody want to guess? Nearly $2 trillion. HUD's program spending is overwhelmingly focused on rental subsidies, as we see at the bottom bar, and secondarily on public housing. Very little of HUD's budgetary authority, about 20%, goes into production, with the exception of how we work with our housing authority partners, as I mentioned a moment ago. But apart from being imbalanced, this housing policy is impossibly regressive. When we look at the distribution of this spending by income, it gets quite sobering. So across the bottom bar, you see income groups by $10,000 increments, with the far right-hand bar being families over $200,000 in family income. The red represents ownership subsidies. The blue represents renter subsidies. You can see that the renter subsidies are highly targeted to the poorest families, $10,000 and $20,000 a year, and the ownership subsidies highly targeted to the highest income earning families. But let's look at the actual distribution of dollars. $128 billion in fiscal year 08 for housing ownership, $35 billion for rental housing. And again, the distribution by income, highly targeted, largely because of vouchers and public housing, largely because of HUD. You take HUD away, and the support for this income class evaporates. It's gone. Estimated average household subsidy by income class. Well, if you're earning $30,000 to $40,000 a year, your average housing benefit with this federal housing policy that we have is, thank you. That's $265. I don't know, 80 cents a day. Pretty good. If you're earning more than $200,000 a year, the federal subsidy to you is more than $6,200. And the most depressing slide of all, this is the utilization rate. So if you're in this income class, what's your percent likelihood of getting something out of federal housing policy? And look what happens as we go up the income scale. 10% of the poorest Americans receive some form of housing assistance. 72% of the wealthiest Americans receive this housing subsidy. Is it any better in the state? You know, I don't remember a statewide housing conference, and it just may be me, where we've ever looked at the tax expenditures in California for homeownership. Mortgage interest deduction, the total cost of this program to California is $5.5 billion in 07, which is the most recent year we have available. $1.3 billion of that goes to families earning over $200,000 a year. Another $2.4 billion goes to families between $100,000 and $200,000. The property tax deduction, $1.4 billion goes to families earning more than $200,000 a year. The capital gains exclusion, more than $3 billion expense. Added up, we have a $10 billion cost to our Treasury because of our homeownership tax subsidies. I suggest that we take up this mantle. The state cannot afford this. Economist after economist has shown that this subsidy is priced into the cost of the housing. We'll talk about phasing this in given the fragility of the market in a moment. But I want us to think seriously about redressing federal and state tax subsidies for home ownership and rebalancing ourselves toward a rental housing policy. So what are the answers? We're going to grow by 7 million households in 40 years. We'll talk a little bit about how that growth happens. Value capture for community benefits through zoning is a strategy that has a long-term prospect for real benefits from us. We've produced more than 30,000 units under inclusionary housing in 30 years in California. We did an analysis in Long Beach as one example around the downtown plan, and I think my time is 10 minutes? Okay. Well, let's spend a minute to talk about Long Beach. So the red line goes from downtown Long Beach to downtown LA, right? And downtown Long Beach now is trying to craft a new plan. Beth's formerly housing director in that fair city, to densify Long Beach, mixed use, smart growth, best principles of sustainable community development to take advantage of that transit link to downtown and to downtown LA. And what they've done is they've provided a plan that over 25 years will result in this very substantial new development in downtown Long Beach. Let's remind ourselves, this is a 25-year land plan. This is not to say that 5,000 units of housing are going to be built tomorrow in Long Beach, or that a 1.5 million square feet of commercial is going to be built in Long Beach. But remind ourselves that through our police powers, as a city, we're putting in place a general plan amendment that will allow for this growth in a smart growth fashion. And we're doing it by providing serious incentives to development. Very large-scale increases in density, reduction in parking requirements, fast-tracked permitting and processing, and a master EIR to remove the CEQA compliance for any complying project with these densities. That's a big deal for developers. So we looked at a way to quantify the value of those incentives to landowners and developers and to determine the extent to which the plan could accommodate community benefits in the form of affordable housing. And we did this by using a land residual value approach. We calculated the income potential of a project, apartments, condominiums, hotels, retail, office, against the cost of developing those projects to determine if there was any additional value added by the plan. And we quantified a positive change as the extent to which the plan could accommodate community benefits set aside. The reality? Increasing to type 1 high-rise construction today in Long Beach is uneconomic. We can't build it today. What we found out in LA in '03 when we did the same analysis was that we couldn't do high-rise residential development in LA. Anybody from LA today? CRA, Housing Department? Sorry? Redevelopment? Oh, you're a developer, okay.
They're builders.
So what we found in '03 was that since the 1986 Tax Reform Act in Los Angeles, 0 type 1 high-rise residential towers had been built, with the exception of a few very high-end luxury towers in Wilshire Corridor, the beach, and some high-end luxury retirement communities. Nothing. And the economic analysis that we did showed steeply negative land values. In the course of 15 months, by '05, 10,000 permits had been pulled for type 1 residential construction. The point I want to make here is that when we do a land plan, we're putting in place the vision for the future of the community and how we're going to live, work, play, recreate, and reside in that community. And we're not doing it for a short-term benefit, so we need to look at it for the long term. We need to understand that while it may not work today, we're putting in place a zone that meets the needs of that community and can be accommodated over time. In Long Beach, we looked at 3 cases: an inclusionary housing unit obligation, an inclusionary housing in lieu fee, and a commercial development linkage fee for affordable housing for non-residential development. And what did we find? So if we just take a minute on these slides, what we're looking at here is the change in land value associated with different development prototypes from the downtown plan as proposed. This first prototype is an apartment project. The 4 bars show increasing density from current plan to proposed plan. And what we can see is that there's an increase in land value in purple of about $60 a foot for the first 3 prototypes, but no change for a type 1 high-rise apartment prototype. And when we add the green, which is a set-aside for affordable housing, we can see that while there's still a reduction in land value, and Leslie, this will look very familiar to you in what we did in San Jose, still a positive net change, meaning that we can afford to provide the affordable housing set-aside and still have a net positive development benefit for the for-profit market rate developer. Condominium analysis had a similar finding. The office prototypes looked horrible. The reason is we just couldn't build or cannot build today in 2011 in Long Beach a high-rise office construction. It simply is not economic. So none of the prototypes are economically feasible. Hotels proved to be actually quite feasible in Long Beach, partly because of the tourist attractions of the downtown. And we can see that very little impact with the commercial development linkage fee is shown on the increase in land value for hotels. What did we find when we did the same analysis in San Jose? And these slides, I think, were determinative, Leslie, with the mayor and the city council. Because what we showed the city council is over time, land prices, now I'm not talking about some theoretical economic residual land value, we're talking about comps. Land prices are highly volatile, regardless of what residential prototype we were looking at. High-rise condos in San Jose, the price of the land for sale, 04 to 06, varied by 106%, as much as 123% for the mid-price condo. Stack flat apartments and condos varied about 60% in a 4-year period. Townhomes, again, land price fluctuations of 60%. Single-family detached housing, land variations from 35 to 60%. And so the point we made to the council was if you're doing nothing, if the city council does nothing, the land prices are going to be hugely volatile, regardless, because of the pressures and stresses of the cyclical nature of real estate markets. And so to impose an obligation for community benefits that's scaled to a fraction of the trading range of land is one way to measure the tolerance for community benefits. We can't overlay development and kill the proverbial golden goose. That's a given. But neither is it true that we can afford to do nothing in this regard. And so I suggest to you that when we combine the Long Beach experience with this examination in San Jose of the trading range of land prices, we can find our way clear to a path of community benefits writ large in California. A 10% set aside statewide for all residential development at, say, 80% AMI would produce 10 to 15,000 units a year. That would match TCAC and SIDLOC's entire production. Linked to this is the provision for and admonition for sustainable development and growth, smart growth, growth that really builds upon the best practices of infill and transit orientation. The Obama administration has made a big effort in this area, as most of us know. HUD, DOT, and EPA have joined in collaboration. This website is the website for the Sustainable Communities Partnership at the federal government. And by the way, this PowerPoint I think is on your website, and it will be on DRA's website. So it's, and if you want my card, I'll send it to you. So all of these links will be available to you. They established 6 principles of national policy for sustainability and growth. And we're going to add, what is it, David? 200, what's the population growth in 2050? I forgot. It's 100 million? 60 million? It's amazing how big a share of the national growth is projected to be California. Yeah. So the idea is that we locate that growth close to transit, reducing commutes, that we promote equitable and affordable housing, that we make regions more economically competitive, that we build upon the strengths of existing communities before going out to new green open spaces, and that we value the characteristics of our existing neighborhoods and communities. So in Los Angeles, we're not going to bulldoze the 1920s to 1940s era single-family neighborhoods. That's not going to happen. So we're really looking at the arterials, and we'll see what SCAG did with that in a second. There are some small planning grants that HUD made available. Some of you may have gotten them. We helped Oakland, Michelle, and Jeff secure one of those awards. That was a big deal. And California is really leading the nation in thinking around this, as is this governor, with AB 32, SB 375, and SB 97. Simply put, AB 32 seeks to control greenhouse gas emissions, which are substantially contributed to through vehicle emissions. We're to lower our emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2020. How are we doing? We have 9 years to go. And by the year 2050, we're to be 80% below 1990 emissions levels. And that's after adding, as we just saw, 7 million new households to the state. The SB 375 lays out a strategy for us to accommodate this. I won't take time unless in the questions you'd like to talk more about this, but I want to show you what this future looks like. This is SCAG's map for its 6-county region for the blueprint plan for growth. It's called the 2% plan. And what this means is that 90% of the growth of jobs and housing units in this 6-county area will occur on 2% of the land area. So if you look at the little, I don't know if you can see it on the map, the little shaded areas, kind of looks like a silicon chip, I guess, or something, right? What is going to happen in those little shaded areas? We're going to have dense, mixed-use, transit-oriented growth. And that is where 7 million people are going to be added in the SCAG region in the next 40 years. You're looking at the map of growth. And when you combine that map with the community benefit strategy that I talked about earlier, you begin to see where we're going to find a place for affordable housing and transit and housing proximate to jobs. And this has been replicated in Sacramento, the first blueprint plan, and other councils of governments throughout the state are at work now on plans very similar to this. Oh, there's no funding for SB 375 planning, by the way. But we have other fiscal problems in our state. There's a small planning grant, Prop 84. There's one more round left, actually in 012. This is a link to the website. Has anybody received a Prop 84 planning grant in the room? What city are you from? Columbus. Great. So, what do we do? I propose we do 7 things. I know it says 6. We're going to rebalance our fiscal policy as it relates to housing at the federal and the state level. We are talking about California here, and I don't want to take too much of our time to talk about a DC agenda. Value capture through zoning is a strategy I would suggest we cannot afford to ignore. We need to think very seriously about buying opportunities for market rate affordable housing to render it permanently affordable in the long term, given the costs of new construction, while at the same time thinking about the need for increasing supply. We need to reform redevelopment regardless of the court's action. We got our heads handed to us politically. We need to learn from that experience and not repeat it. We cannot continue to lobby and advocate as we have for redevelopment and for housing. That didn't work, and it's not going to work in the future. Employer-assisted housing and housing authority partnerships and mortgage modification. Federal budget and tax reform, I want to suggest a mirror image of this at the state. Eliminate the mortgage interest, property tax deduction, and capital gains exclusion for earners over $200,000. I don't think they need it. Eliminate the second home, and eliminate the capital gains exclusion. Why are we subsidizing the appreciation on a home? Why is that asset more valuable than something else? I don't understand that. Redirect half of that savings to deficit reduction and half to worst-case housing needs in the United States. Those steps do need to be moderated. This housing market is intensely fragile and could not take a shock immediately, in my opinion. So we're talking about maybe, say, a 5-year phase-in, so people can accommodate to that and the market can have time to adjust. Assess a 10 basis point fee on servicing for every mortgage in the United States. This will produce $10 billion a year. Now we have $30 billion a year in newfound money. That compares to HUD's current budget of $45 billion. Modernize the Community Reinvestment Act and assertively implement the Dodd-Frank regulations to strike at the heart of this agenda of affordable housing, neighborhood revitalization, and sustainable community development through our partners in the banks and investment industries. Let's start a conversation about 10% of new residential development as statewide law set aside at 80% AMI. What's interesting is all of our subsidy programs are targeted at or below 60% AMI. We have a hole in our donut at the 60 to 80% window, and much of the rental market is at 80% AMI. So I want to suggest that this is actually not a frivolous proposal, but something that cities can move more aggressively on, and a number of cities, more than 100, have adopted inclusionary housing programs that are more assertive than this. But that we have a hold harmless minimum requirement as a matter of our general plan land use law in the state of California. Focus on acquisition of market rate. Look at acquisition of multifamily portfolios in Fannie and Freddie. Look at the very interesting, the last bullet item, opportunity to acquire single-family REO as rental housing. Is anyone in the room familiar with this issue? The Federal Housing Finance Agency, which is the regulator of Fannie and Freddie, and the conservator, has let a request for information on asking for ideas about how to transform this single-family REO portfolio into a long-term affordable rental portfolio. It's going to require a particular challenge, scattered site rental single-family housing management, but something that I think some of the best housing authorities and best nonprofits in the state are up to. There are two principal assets of housing authorities that we need to more strategically use: project-based vouchers and the somewhat, in many cases, lower densities of older era public housing sites, which can be revitalized and redeveloped a la Hope 6, but sadly without Hope 6 funding. And I think that the partnerships among housing departments and redevelopment agencies and housing authorities can go a long way. A number of departments have done a fabulous job in promoting these partnerships. Employer-assisted housing has not come of age, and we need to pay attention to this. If we have a two-worker household and both spouses or partners are getting a health benefit, one of those health benefits at the cost of $400 to $800 a month is going unused. Why not have a cafeteria option which allows a partner to elect a housing benefit in lieu of a health benefit? And let's also look at the possible joint use development of housing on campus-like settings for both public and private sector employers. Mortgage modification, before we get to that, the now what slide? We have suggested that we take the underwater mortgages that I alluded to earlier and bifurcate them into two pieces. The first would be appraised at current fair market value, refinanced at current historic low rates, would generate about $25 billion a year in new cash flow for spending into the economy, and subordinate the second piece on a deferred payment basis. That would be an equity share between the homeowner and the mortgage holder. And we may have lost the value, but I suggest to you that the value doesn't exist today. And it's a kind of phony collateral that we're nodding and winking at on balance sheets of Fannie and Freddie and banks and investors and trusts who hold those loans. That's actually under consideration by the administration as we talk now. So the answer to this question of now what is either where we started, or if we revitalize our own voices. So let's take a minute to list who we are. The nonprofit Federation of Affordable Housing in San Diego, the Southern California Association for Nonprofit Housing, the Northern California Association for Nonprofit Housing, CRA, Cal Alpha, Housing California, Rural California, the California Housing Consortium. Have I forgotten the California Association of Realtors and the California Home Builders Council? We need to speak with one voice. If I've suggested anything today, we potentially could see $2 to $4 billion in new cash to the California Treasury by making more progressive our tax expenditures for home ownership. Well, we need the realtors and the home builders to buy into that proposal. And I was talking with Jerry Ramiza before remarks today. I'm not sure that we need a 2/3 vote to do that, because we're not adopting a new revenue, we're amending a statutory deduction. Now, I'm not smart enough to know the answer to that, or haven't researched it thoroughly enough yet, but I want to suggest that as an option. So if we can revitalize our coalition and really see ourselves as a housing and real estate alliance for progressive and sustainable development in the state of California, given our challenges, then I think we face a lot more. Thank you. Good time for questions?
Tom, do we have a few?
Say again?
Do we have a few minutes?
Sure.
Okay.
Go. Rock and roll.
It's easy
You're not
today.
going to say no to my boss? No, we do. Yeah, I'm looking for the,
Here, you can have this one.
okay,
You can have this one.
You
okay.
can have all of them. Here, take one for each hand.
Here, okay, questions. We have time for a few. I knew Kofi would be one. What an introduction.
Great. David, that's a great presentation. I think one idea that I can pick up from is that we need to reform redevelopment agency. But actually, we understand reform is overdue. But how can we reform the redevelopment agency without also looking at taxing entities that are also claiming components of our tax increment? That is one area, because we have the school districts, we have mosquito abatement, we have several, and fire, and that is a separate issue. Also, I want to go over what the president had indicated, Barton. The issue is this. The issue that we're talking is that we have a state in control of local property tax revenue, but we don't live in a regional government. We have multiple local governments, and you also have come up with a recommendation for a zoning reform so that local government could be able to manage their finance. Okay. I need these questions to be addressed.
Did that wake up everybody after that? Or? Okay, that's Kofi. Anyway, go ahead, please address it there.
Well,
Can you address
like
it?
Mel Brooks said, I'm going to go wash up. You know, Linda's remarks represent the confluence of politics and law. And I was talking at lunch with colleagues about Jerry Brown as mayor of Oakland and as governor of California. And the comment was, well, gee, why is the governor so opposed to redevelopment when he was such an advocate for redevelopment while he was mayor? And my answer was, where you stand depends upon where you sit. For what it's worth, my own view is that the fiscal problems in California are much more serious than even what Linda laid out. And they strike at the heart of Proposition 13 and the inability of local government to raise revenue and the inability of the legislature to raise revenue without a 2/3 vote. We didn't get to it in the report, in the remarks, but we're chasing retail development at local government level. Why? Because it's the only source of revenue that cities and counties can spur beyond state control. And we're fiscalizing our land use, creating crummy jobs at crummy wages in the process. So I actually think the answer to your question strikes at just the heart of California's fiscal malaise. And I don't know that we have a solution to the constitutional restrictions on revenue in the state because of the 2/3 vote requirement. With regard to your zoning comment, I think that's part of the way out, because Prop 13 does not control zoning. We're talking now about the police power of municipalities to promote the general welfare. And the kind of value capture strategies, we already do this through special assessment districts and development agreements and negotiations and conditions on entitlements and developments. It's 50-year practice in land use in California. I'm suggesting that we need to elevate it, given the kind of growth that we're facing.